Today I'm reviewing Swamp Thing: The Bronze Age, Volume 3. Now this represents my first encounter with the Swamp Thing. This is the first time I've read any of his comics. I've previously not seen any of the movies or any of the TV shows. This is my first foray into the Swamp Thing stories. So those of you who are already Swamp Thing experts will have to be forgiving of this video, or I don't know, maybe don't watch it. But if you do watch it with a forgiving eye, and by all means, feel free to correct me in the comments if I get anything wrong. So you may wonder, if I've never read any Swamp Thing before, why start with the Bronze Age Volume 3? Well, this relates to something I often talk about on this channel, which is the fact that I'm currently living in Vietnam and my access to English books is limited. So quite often, instead of reading the books I really want to read, I just read what's available. When I first moved to Vietnam 9 years ago, you didn't really see any English comic books, at least not if my memory serves. So at that time I read no comic books when I was living in Vietnam. But they are now starting to hit the bigger stores here. We'll have a selection of American English comic books. A very limited selection and a somewhat random selection, but they are there now, which they didn't used to be. But yes, it is a very limited and random selection. Now, why the Swamp Thing Bronze Age Volume 3 was on the shelves and not the Swamp Thing Volume 1 or 2, I really don't know. And the other odd thing, if you look at the prices here, this is $39.99 in the USA, but it's 598,000 Vietnamese dong, which, if you factor in the exchange rate, is actually significantly cheaper. Now, usually when you import comic books into Vietnam, it is more expensive because you're paying them to be shipped over. But I wonder, I have a little theory that perhaps the reason it's cheaper is because it didn't sell in America. And so they imported the comics into Vietnam that wouldn't sell in America, and that's why it's cheaper, because they're trying to get rid of it. I don't know. That's just a theory. But, I mean, other than that, I wouldn't have thought there would be much market for Swamp Thing in Vietnam. I could be wrong. But yeah, the reason I started off with Bronze Age Volume 3 instead of Volume 1 or 2 is because that's just what happened to be available. The reason I picked up the Swamp Thing at all is because the selection of American comic books was quite limited. So of the limited selection, this one looked like it was the most interesting to me. I've done a little bit of research on this in Goodreads and Amazon and Wikipedia and stuff like that. And the Swamp Thing went through a few different phases. It initially started in 1972, I believe, and had a run that was well received from 1972 to 1976 before it got canceled. And then it was revived in 1982 because of the movie. So there was a Swamp Thing movie which hit theaters in 1982, and you can see issue 2 here is making full use of the movie tie-in. Now a major motion picture from Avco Embassy, The Saga of the Swamp Thing. And this picture here has nothing to do with the contents of the comic, but it's, you know, they're advertising it as seen on the big picture screen. And then the annual issue, the annual issue is actually not tied to the continuity of the comic. The annual issue here is just the adaptation of the movie Swamp Thing. Now, like I said, I've not actually seen the 1982 Swamp Thing movie. It was slightly before my time. 1982, I was alive, technically. I was 4 years old, but I lived in a very sheltered, isolated Christian community, and I wasn't allowed to watch this kind of stuff, and I didn't have access to it, and I had no idea what was going on. By the time the sequel came out, though, in 1989, I was old enough that I was aware enough of culture to be aware of it. Like I was reading the entertainment sections of the newspapers and stuff like that. I still wasn't allowed to see it, but I mean, I knew there was a movie called The Return of the Swamp Thing, or what was the name of the sequel? Whatever the sequel was called. And I was, I think, vaguely aware of some of the television adaptations of the Swamp Thing in the 90s, but never saw any of them. So I guess that's my history with the Swamp Thing, being vaguely aware of it. I read DC Comics in the early 90s. I guess around 92, 93, 94, I was collecting DC Comics as much as my meager allowance would afford me. And the Swamp Thing, I never encountered the Swamp Thing in any of that. He wasn't really part of the DC mainstream continuity at that point. I think he was spun off into the Vertigo imprint. At one point over the years, I got a little bit curious whether the Swamp Thing was connected to DC continuity or not. And I think years ago, I spent an afternoon reading up on the Swamp Thing Wikipedia article. But that was one afternoon several years ago, and haven't really returned to the Swamp Thing since then. So to sum up, I guess I could say I've been vaguely aware of the Swamp Thing. I've been very vaguely curious about him for quite some time, but this is the first book I've picked up. But if during the research, reading some of the Goodreads reviews of this, and also reading the Wikipedia article, it looks like this is one of the low points of the Swamp Thing's run. So the original series in 1972 to 1976 was quite well received. This revival, which was relaunched in 1982, ran on for about 19 issues before the original writer got busy, and then they turned it over to a British guy named Alan Moore. And Alan Moore's run on it was very well received and is very well regarded. But this is not the Alan Moore run. These are like the series of the newly relaunched Swamp Thing right before Alan Moore has it. So over on Goodreads, it looks like the Swamp Thing fans are saying that these stories are subpar. They're not equal to the original 1970s run, and they certainly don't hold up to what apparently was a very creative run that Alan Moore had on it. That being said, though, I think there are some points of interest in here. It's not great, but there are some interesting points of interest, and I'll try and go through and highlight what I thought was maybe interesting about this as I go. But before I get into any of that, there is one major thing I want to highlight, which is that this edition is missing pages. So, issue number 18 here, the Saga of the Swamp Thing. We open with a setup of the story. It goes into a flashback. Then we have the title page here, the credits, title page, The Man Who Would Not Die. And then on the very next page over, we go right to the epilogue. And we're like, what happened there? Now, if you look here, the page count seems to be in order. 342 over here, 343 over here. But this is a very short issue. It's an issue that's just 6 pages long here. 3 pages double-sided. So it looks like the middle of this issue just got lost during the printing. Now, I've searched this many times on Google to see if anybody else has noticed this or if anybody else has been complaining about it. Searched, missing pages or Swamp Thing, The Bronze Age, Volume 3, missing pages, etc. And oddly enough, I can't find too many people complaining about this. Nothing on Goodreads. On the Amazon page, there are 2 people complaining that these pages are missing from the Kindle edition, and they both specify the Kindle edition. And it's these exact same pages. One of them even gives, they both give the issue. One of them even gives the page numbers here. Exactly the same pages as this print edition. It's crossed my mind that maybe this is because I bought it in Vietnam, something is wrong with this edition, but I don't think so. I bought this at a reputable bookstore here in Vietnam. It doesn't look like a bootleg version. And I don't know, if anyone else has bought the paper edition of this, let me know whether or not these pages were missing in your edition. I'm going to assume this is not just a Vietnamese thing, that these pages are legitimately missing from this print edition, which I view as a major oversight on the part of the publisher. I mean, especially considering how much people pay for these things. And I know I got this for a bit of a reduced price in Vietnam here, but still, even in Vietnam, it's like still $25. If you're going to pay that much for a book, you want the editor to at least check that all the pages have printed and that it's not missing 20 pages in the middle of the book, right? That's inexcusable. So, doesn't completely spoil the book. Those 20 pages are, I don't know if this is a coincidence or not, but those 20 pages are all a flashback. So they're not even part of the main storyline. They're one of the villain's origin stories. Okay, so that out of the way, let's see if we can go through some things and talk about them. Someone described this on Goodreads as a soft reboot of The Swamp Thing. And I can see that title here. I can see that name being applicable. It opens up with the Swamp Thing's origins retold. And then the Swamp Thing goes on all new adventures here, where the continuity of the original run, or the characters from the original run, don't really appear at all until the very end. Right at the very end, we get some of the characters and continuity from the original Swamp Thing come back here. But that's only at the very end. For most of this volume, you wouldn't even know that the Swamp Thing had any previous continuity or previous stories or previous characters. It just seems to be like a completely fresh start. So again, I'm somebody who has not read any of the Swamp Thing before, but I do have to admit that the premise and the character are intriguing. So he's working on this like miracle growth thing for plants, this chemical. And the bad guys want to get a hold of his chemical formula. He refuses to sell it to them. So they sabotage a lab. There's an explosion where he is set on fire. And the chemicals, the miracle growth chemicals, are burning him. His wife is killed by the explosion, which is kind of like his tragic backstory. And he runs into the swamp. And then he dives into the swamp. Of course, there are all sorts of living things in the swamp, right? All sorts of bacteria, microorganisms, and algae. And so he's already had much of his skin burned away. And he's just absorb it. He's got that growth formula on him, and he's just absorbing all the microorganisms of the swamp and turning into this like plant man creature. So there's you know, I've never lived in the bayou. I've never spent any significant amount of time in a swamp, but you don't really have to kind of buy into the mythology of it. In fact, maybe it's even better if you don't. You can romanticize it all the better. Just like the creator of Tarzan apparently never went to Africa in his life. If that's not too much of a stretch, that comparison. So I really was here for this mysterious creature of these swamps, which were lands of, you know, exotic animals and all these creatures. But what's a little bit odd about this volume, and I'm not sure if this is typical of the Swamp Thing generally, he really doesn't stay in the swamp long before he's heading off on all these adventures around the world. So here he is kind of in the snows of Europe battling this Nazi witch. I'll get to that a little bit later maybe. Yeah. The premise of a character who's got this symbiotic relationship with the swamp and is an outgrowth of the swamp is intriguing, but they don't really make full use of that in these stories. I guess, you know, maybe there's only so much you can do in the swamp, to be fair. The Swamp Thing, I think, has his origins in horror comics, and a number of these issues are somewhat horror adjacent. I mean, they're at this point they're still under the comics code, but you know, he fights vampires. It's a little bit creepy. There's demons and stuff like that. So there's some. He's a superhero, but it's horror adjacent type stories. Now, maybe because these are horror stories, I don't know, or horror adjacent stories, each issue, especially the beginning issues, have the plots be driven by people doing things that make no sense, as is quite typical of horror movies, right? So, I mean, we can see this right from the first issue. The Swamp Thing is approaching some drunken hunters here. A bear comes out. The Swamp Thing saves the hunters from the bear. So far, so good. But then, the Swamp Thing sees the drunken hunters, and for some reason, he gets it into his head that he needs to disarm them. So he says, "Hand over the shotgun, Hambone. It's too dangerous a toy for someone in your condition." Now, the Swamp Thing can't talk, or he can only really talk with great difficulty, so he can only say a few words at a time. So he can't communicate this, but he just tries to disarm him. And the hunters react, of course, as you would expect them to react, by just being terrified of this monster who, from their perspective, has attacked them for no reason. And this, you know, sets up the conflict between the Swamp Thing and the people of this small town who view the Swamp Thing as a boogeyman. And you think, well, of course, why? What were you thinking, Swamp Thing? And the Swamp Thing still has the mind of the original scientist, Alec Holland, who was turned into the Swamp Thing. So Alec Holland, the intelligent scientist, should have known better than to attempt this. And that's quite typical of a number of these stories where the plot is just driven by characters just doing things that make absolutely no sense. At least one of them per issue. Also, the Swamp Thing, at least in these beginning issues, his powers are a little bit ill-defined. I don't know what the other stories are like, but a lot of this seems to revolve around the fact that the Swamp Thing is a plant, and monsters don't like plants. So here we go. The Swamp Thing is fighting vampires, and one of the vampires tried to drink his blood, but there's not blood, it's just plant mucus over there. This is in quite a few of them. A demon tries to possess the Swamp Thing, but turns out the Swamp Thing is a plant creature. Or there's a sea monster type creature that they encounter, but it doesn't like the mucus in the Swamp Thing's blood. So just the fact that the Swamp Thing is a strange. Oh yeah, here we go. So for some reason the Swamp Thing's plant. The creature is one of those creatures like Invasion of the Body Snatchers type thing who tries to take over humans. But it is repelled by the Swamp Thing's plant-like blood. So, I guess that's his superpower. He's a plant. He's also quite strong. Now, having kind of made fun of these stories thus far, to give credit where credit is due, as you read through these, some interesting dynamics start to take place. So characters you thought were originally bad guys turn out to be good guys, and characters you thought were good guys turned out to be bad guys. And I'm going to give the writers the benefit of the doubt and assume that this was planned from the beginning. So in the beginning, there's this evil henchman of the Sunderland Corporation. The Sunderland Corporation is persecuting the Swamp Thing, who is trying to kill the Swamp Thing and also this child that the Swamp Thing is protecting. But as the course of these issues progress, we get hints that evil henchman is actually has some sort of ulterior motives, and that child that the Swamp Thing has been protecting is actually a very evil child. This is kind of like the Omen, where there's this very evil entity in a child's body. And the Swamp Thing, the change from good guys to bad guys, I think works in the sense that I don't think there's, if you go back and reread the first issues, I don't think there's any continuity that's broken. Some of the characters' motivations are kept murky at the beginning, but I think that was all set up in a way to deceive the reader fairly well without breaking any rules. What doesn't work so well about this is all of these characters are incredibly bland. So there's about 3 characters who are accompanying the Swamp Thing who at least have some sort of personality. Or at least identifiable characteristics, maybe would be a better way of putting that. But then in addition to those 3, there's a slightly bigger entourage, which are just names. So these characters here are good examples. This is the... Who is this guy? He's the producer character of the... He's a producer of one of the reporter characters. And he gets abducted by the child witch-like character. They heal him. Here he is again, and he comes along with them on their adventures into Europe. and he's just around for several issues, and they talk about him like he's an important member of the team, but he doesn't do anything. And there's a whole bunch of just kind of, I don't know, red shirt type characters. So here's an example. They're fighting the child demon, and one of them runs at the child demon, says, "You do not frighten me, monster child." It says, "Rachel, no!" And she gets burned up. And I was like, Rachel? Who was Rachel? Was that somebody important? Well, if you go back and look, I guess Rachel is name dropped here in earlier issues. Like, here are the people working with me. Their names are Rachel, Samuel, Ellen, and Carl. Okay, so I guess there was a Rachel mentioned back here. This was like an issue or two ago. So you can't say she wasn't set up. Sorry, was it the same issue? Maybe it was the same issue. That's the problem with reading these things as a volume, is sometimes the issues all run together in your mind. But yeah, and even the characters who are more major are pretty boring here. I guess when Alan, according to Wikipedia, once Alan Moore got a hold of this comic, he got rid of the supporting cast for the Swamp Thing. You can't really feel like that was any great loss here. There's an ongoing story about this battle between the Omen-like child demon, which is okay. I don't know. It's not great. It's kind of boring. But mixed in with that story are various side stories. Some of them are interesting. So this here about a bunch of Vietnam War veterans. I guess because this was out in 1982, the Vietnam War was still fresh in everyone's mind. Vietnam War veterans who had, with a telepath, created this movie world of their own out on this deserted island they'd been put onto. It ends, of course, with characters doing stuff that makes no sense. As I said, there's at least one action in every issue of a character doing something that makes absolutely no sense. And then there was another interesting story kind of near the end about this land that the Swamp Thing goes to, this village that the Swamp Thing goes to, where everyone's a monster, but they all wear masks that kind of hide their appearance. Again, it doesn't fully make sense because it's like this, I don't know, and like unless it's like a Narnia type thing, it seems to be this hidden town that's right off the main road. That part of it doesn't seem to make sense, but the general story itself is interesting. I'm almost out of time. Sorry, I have a camera that stops recording after 30 minutes. That's the file size limit for this camera. I could start recording again and do another file, but then I'd have to edit them together, and that's always more trouble than it's worth. Besides, I usually figure after I've talked for 30 minutes that perhaps I've talked long enough. So I'm going to have to wrap this up pretty quick. There are any number of things I didn't get around to talking about. The Phantom Stranger, who shows up for a couple issues. According to Wikipedia, originally the Phantom Stranger was sharing the comic book with the Swamp Thing. So the Swamp Thing would get like the first half of the issue. The Phantom Stranger would have stories in the second half of the issue, but then they stopped the Phantom Stranger stories. So he just shows up in a couple of the Swamp Thing issues. Yeah. Okay, I'm out of time here. So there are other things I would have talked about, but I've talked long enough. If you read this issue, let me know what you think about it. Sorry, this collection.